Today we're going to explain the mystery of the Trinity. Does that mean we're going to solve the mystery of the Trinity? Does that mean that by the end of this particular piece of content, you will no longer think the Trinity is mysterious? Well, you're just going to have to listen to find out. Here we go, explaining the mystery of the Trinity from a Christian Orthodox perspective. Let's hit it. No, the Trinity is not mysterious because it insists that 1 + 1 + 1 = 1. I think I heard that in a Christian rap song once, and it's a bad song and it's bad theology. But Christians often do find the Trinity mysterious because Christianity does not conform cleanly with philosophical monotheism in a straightforward way in terms of the philosophy of religion. Christianity is a monotheistic religion, but its conception of God is caught up in a seemingly irresolvable tension between the oneness of God and the threeness of God. Now, this mystery was pointedly and explicitly articulated first in the Nicene. Well, it was of course articulated in Scripture, but it was articulated quite well and quite pointedly in the Nicene Creed, which says that the Son of God is, quote, of one substance with the Father. That's homoousion to patri. Now, the real mystery of the Trinity occurs regarding the triune metaphysical schematics of divine existence. Now, what does that mean? Now, that is, it is mysterious how God's single substance can be metaphysically absolute and yet exist as three persons. And at the same time, how God can exist as three distinct persons without compromising the metaphysical characteristics of an essence that is a se, or of a single essence without a source. And anybody who is quick to defend the rationality or the reasonableness of the Trinity, I am sympathetic with them insofar as I believe that the Trinity is a rational concept. But at the same time, anybody who goes so far as to say that the Trinity is so reasonable that it is not at all mysterious, well, that is something to which I would object, because the philosophical problem posed to us by the Trinity is very difficult to resolve, if it can be resolved at all. And it resembles something closer to what Christians would call paradox or divine incomprehensibility than it would be sort of a lay or common theologian's initial theological difficulty with a complex concept. The Trinity is not just mysterious because it's complex. The Trinity is mysterious because it represents a unique philosophical problem which many Orthodox Christian theologians have found irresolvable. Does that mean that God is irrational? No. It means it's one of the aspects of his existence which he has revealed to us, which we can't draw a full circle around, or haven't yet, or maybe some brilliant young 20-something has. I don't know. Here we go. We are going to investigate the elements which make the Trinity uniquely mysterious. We're going to put our finger on exactly what is mysterious about the Trinity doctrine. First, we have to understand the oneness of God. Now, traditionally, Christians have posited a doctrine which explains the single essence of God, called divine simplicity. Now, the doctrine of simplicity states, and I've published an article on this called the Thomistic Conception of Divine Simplicity, or something like that, in the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society. I'll link to that in the show notes. But simplicity states not that God's existence is a simple-minded matter. That's not what simplicity means. But rather that God is not composed of parts. If you think of a machine is complex if it has a bunch of parts, right? And human beings are complex in a sense. We're composed of a soul and a body and an intellect and whatever it is, everything, all the ingredients of humanity. But there are no ingredients in God. There's no, or if there is, there's only one ingredient. And that's what the doctrine of simplicity proposes. It is divinity. It is God himself, right? Simplicity states that there are no real distinctions in God, or there are no composite parts in God. He is not made of love and power and holiness and beauty and all the divine perfections, and then you shake it all up, right, in your protein shaker, all right, and then you get God. No, so the doctrine of simplicity is meant to reject that notion of God, that he is like a word jumble of philosophical absolutes. He's not. Rather, he is simply God. And any attempts to explain distinctions in God are made for the sake of creatures. And in this regard, Reformers made a distinction between archetypal theology and ectypal theology, and we ought to utilize this distinction for our benefit. And what they mean by this distinction between archetypal and ectypal theology is this: theology which is true as God knows it is archetypal theology, and theology which is true as humans know it is ectypal theology. Now, humans could not categorically conceive of archetypal theology. They simply couldn't do it, because archetypal theology occurs simultaneously with itself and analytically. Now, what that means is this: archetypal theology is analytic, which means that it is not composed of a web of syllogisms as human theology must be, but exists as a single self-contained act of self-knowledge on God's part. So, for example, in human knowledge, in philosophy, for example, we might argue or make an argument on the basis of certain premises, and we might say P1, P2, P3, conclusion, right? And that is premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, conclusion. But because God is not composed of parts, then real distinctions would require that God doesn't exist in process, but exists. His knowledge is his omniscience is itself a divine perfection. And therefore, God's knowledge is not composed of distinctions between premises, but exists as a single premise in his own mind. All of knowledge is contained analytically within itself in its own mind. And this term analytic comes from Immanuel Kant. And the way that Kant uses it is like this: if I were to say that a bachelor is single, well, that is an analytic claim, because the predicate is contained in the subject. For God, all predicates are contained within the subject with regard to his own knowledge. Now, we might ask ourselves, well, how could God know multiple things in a single act of analytic self-knowledge? We don't know. That's what makes it incomprehensible. That's why we have to make the distinction between archetypal and ectypal theology. What does it mean to know everything that there is to know about God analytically? We don't know. We couldn't possibly know what that's like. We can't conceive of it, because human beings are in progress. We're finite. We experience time as relative. We experience time as a sequence. And because we experience time as a relative sequence, we must produce our knowledge in terms of dialectical and diachronic syllogisms, which means that all of our knowledge, just like all of our being and our constitution, is composite. It's not simple. It's very complex. Therefore, ectypally, we must distinguish between two aspects of divine unity. Divine, what theologians have called singularitas, and simplicitatis. Now, singularitas, or God's singularitas, refers to the unicity of the divine essence, that there is one essence. God doesn't have multiple essences, right? And God is not a compilation of essences. That's what it means to say that God is singularitas. God is simplicitatis, in that this term refers more specifically and apophatically to the absence of real distinctions within God. So simplicity has been a way that Christians have philosophically affirmed the metaphysical independence of God from the world. And one way of stating that in a philosophical sense, in an Aristotelian sense, is by saying that God is not composed of parts, that his essence is simple. So because God does not exist underneath any philosophical idea, so for instance, God is not loving because he must appeal to some abstract principle called love, where God says, well, if I want to be loving, well, I know love is this concept that exists outside of me, and if I want to be loving, well, I have to conform to that. No. God is love so purely that any creaturely love or any philosophical concept of love is merely a derivation, a mimification of a divine attribute. And the philosophical idea of love explains something divine rather than God being loving because there's some third Platonic form or some third philosophical realm of philosophical ideas which he didn't create, to which he must conform in order to be who he is. That is not the Christian position. It's quite opposite. The Orthodox position is that God quite literally is simply himself, and derivatively, an infinite number of attributes when he interfaces with creation, right? So you see all of these things in the same way that you see multiple colors refracted through a crystal, right? You might see, in a sense, the crystal is one thing and the light is one thing, but it's It's in every single analogy for God, of course, breaks down at some point, but it's just a way. It's an analogy for conceiving of the way in which God Himself does not have any compositions, but when He interfaces with us, certain distinctions become truthful about Him, even if they are only true archetypally and categorically don't compute archetypally, because we have to make that distinction between how God knows Himself and how we know God through His speech to us as creatures. So that's the most important aspect of the oneness of God that we need to understand with regard to how the Trinity is mysterious, is divine simplicity. Now, regarding the threeness of God, the Orthodox position has developed to accommodate God's oneness. And in other words, whatever options are available to the tradition must first pass the threshold of divine simplicity. It must not threaten God's non-composition. So Richard Muller, a church historian teaching at Calvin College, writes in his 4-volume work, Post-Reformation Reformed Dogmatics, that there are 5 possible modalities of existence which could classify the 3 persons of the Trinity. And these 5 modalities could also be called the 5 kinds of distinctions between the persons. So how do we distinguish between the persons, right? How do we distinguish between the 3 persons of the Trinity without violating divine simplicity? These 5 modalities could also be called 5 kinds of distinctions between the persons, I guess. So the 5 kinds of distinctions are this: a rational distinction, a formal distinction, a virtual distinction, a real distinction, and a personal distinction. And that a personal distinction is 4 and 5. Real distinctions and personal distinctions are probably functionally the same in Reformed theology. So it was this 4th mode, the realiter, this real distinction, which was utilized to avoid pitfalls of modalism on the one hand and tritheism on the other hand. However, a subdistinction was required within this concept of real distinction. So real distinction was found if the distinctions between the persons or among the persons of the Trinity were merely rational or formal or virtual, then that would be a modalist doctrine of God, because the persons wouldn't be real enough per se. But if the metaphysical legitimacy of the 3 persons was too substantive, well, then you were breaching tritheism. So one of the ways that the Reformers did this was they distinguished within this category of the realiter, the real distinction, right? This real modality of existence, this 4th option. They distinguished between a major real distinction, distinctio realis major, and a minor real distinction, distinctio realis minor, in order to avoid attributing separate essences to the real person. So they were minor real distinctions, okay? That's what the persons were according to the Reformed Orthodox. The Eastern Orthodox have sought to make a more robust claim about the threeness of God by claiming that the persons are more than subsistences. They're more than minor real distinctions. They're more than distinctio realis minor, but are rather energies or energeia. Consequently, their strategy, which they have conscripted for achieving a doctrine of divine unity, is called the doctrine of perichoresis. So that the 3 persons so mutually indwell and exhaust one another that they are functionally one, while yet they are metaphysically individuated. And this isn't a bad doctrine, but it becomes a bad doctrine when perichoresis becomes your fundamental strategy for achieving a doctrine of divine unity, so that you actually utilize perichoresis in place of divine essence, in place of divine substance. That's not good. And this sort of formulation could not cohere or coexist with a simplicitist conception of divine unity, or a divine unity conception of the divine essence, which requires simplicitatis as a metaphysical articulation of the absoluteness of God's essence. Because in this Aristotelian framework, which has supplied Western Christianity with its concepts, would classify those energies as substances, yielding 3 substances, and therefore tritheism, which has always been the Western critique of the Eastern doctrine of the Trinity, which many progressives are coming to fetishize these days. So now, what exactly is mysterious about the Trinity in light of what we know about the oneness of God and the threeness of God? Now, Christians often frame the Trinitarian mystery as being stuck between 2 options. a prioritization of the one and the three. And traditionally, because of the heavy influence of Augustine on the development of Christian orthodoxy between the early church and the Reformation, Western Christianity has leaned toward prioritizing the oneness of God and conceived of the three secondarily, while the Eastern Orthodox churches, as we have kind of talked about already, have emphasized the three and formulate softer versions of divine unicity, often lacking divine simplicity altogether, and therefore really aren't all that concerned with a metaphysical way of communicating the absoluteness of God, because that was more an Aristotelian project anyway, with which the Orthodox weren't all too concerned. So the problem is that if you give too small a metaphysical due to the three, well, then you risk becoming a modalist. And if you give too small of a metaphysical due to the oneness of God, well, then you risk becoming a tritheist. And both are heresies, and both contradict the creeds and Scripture. There exists, then, in the Orthodox Trinitarian formulation, a sliding scale which represents what has so far been an insurmountable paradox for Christianity. The stronger one's formulation of divine unicity and simplicity, the more the Christian doctrine of God is able to accumulate credibility and integrity as a truly monotheistic religion. By strongly formulating God's unicity and simplicity, Christian theologians resolve what is mysterious about the Trinity, but they risk denying sufficient metaphysical status to the three persons to which the Scriptures and the creeds testify. Now, the stronger one's formulation of divine threeness, the greater weight is given to the theological uniqueness of Trinitarian monotheism, which is certainly attested to by Scripture. And this solution, codified mainly by the Eastern Orthodox, solves the Trinitarian mystery by resolving to settle for a weaker definition of divine unity that dispenses with the notion of a simple divine substance and loses its metaphysical strategy for asserting philosophically the absoluteness of the divine essence, and therefore what makes him distinct from creation. And in this case, God could still be conceived as having a aseity, but there wouldn't remain a philosophical way of articulating the metaphysics of that aseity. And this is what is mysterious about the Trinity, is the sliding scale of prioritizing the oneness of God in terms of his simplicity, which protects his aseity and the credibility of Christian monotheism, but risks modalism, and the threeness of God, which protects the identity and existence of the three persons, but risks tritheism. I want to be able to state this mystery without making it sound as if I am critiquing Christianity, because it's important for Christians to have a place for mystery within their theology while wrestling with what appears to be contradictions, and at the same time not falling into the rationalist fallacy. And it's very difficult to do. Christian mystery is very difficult, but my strategy here is to say what exactly is mysterious about the Trinity. So don't take me as critiquing the coherence of Christian theology. I'm simply trying to highlight what exactly is mysterious about this doctrine. So, about this doctrine of the Trinity. So the doctrine of simplicity doesn't allow Christian theologians to posit any metaphysical quiddity or quality to the divine persons per se. And I know Thomists who are listening are freaking the F out right now, okay? This is my position. I have argued this in several peer-reviewed published articles. So this is my position, that the doctrine of simplicity, people want to make it sound, people want to make the coherence of the three with a Thomistic conception of simplicity sound so reasonable and so rational, like there's no problems at all. There are problems, okay? You are downplaying the mysteriousness of this concept. You are if you say that you have a simplicitist account of divine essence and a substantive and weighty and biblical account of the personhood of the three, and yet there is no mystery there, you've completely philosophically reasoned it all out, I would argue you are the one who hasn't thought deeply enough about this. I would argue that, because the doctrine of simplicity, it does not allow Christian theologians to posit metaphysical quiddity or quality to the divine persons per se. But the tradition compels simplicitists to do so. It compels them to posit metaphysical quiddity and quality to the divine persons. So simplicists, I know that they would wrangle with me on this point, but the point is that in the typical Western construal, God, in the Augustinian tradition, God is more one than he is three. Even if that doesn't make its way into a formulated account. I know Thomists and Reformed, people following in the Reformed tradition who are basically Thomists, Reformed Thomists, they would say, no, God is equally three and one. But your metaphysics doesn't reflect that. The architecture of your theology says the exact opposite. It says that God is more one than he is three. Even if that doesn't make its way into a formulated account in Reformed Thomism, the threeness of God within Reformed Thomism is functionally minimized in the Augustinian tradition. And if you can't just admit to that, well, then you're either in denial or you're not well read enough in the tradition, because it clearly is the case. The doctrine of the Trinity conflicts with purist accounts of the divine essence that want to posit radical versions of non-compositeness about God's essence. Of course, the problem is that simplicists want to claim that the metaphysical quality of each divine person, well, it's not the sort of quality that compromises the integrity of simplicity. But if simplicity is the absolute absence of metaphysical composition and therefore the absence of real distinction, then the three persons cannot have real and idiosyncratic metaphysical properties which characterize them each as persons, even if they do share an essence. So you say, okay, well, they're subsistio, or they're minor real subsistences, or they're minor real relations. Fine. Subsistio realis minor. Fine. The threeness of God still has to be more than that. You still haven't explained exactly what is the quality of a minor real relation, which makes it more than a virtual or formal or rational distinction. It has to be more than that. And until you explain what exactly is the quiddity of a minor real relation, which makes it more than a virtual or formal or rational distinction, then you have not actually given substantive metaphysical weight to the three enough that is attested to by Scripture and the creeds. And you need to do that. And Calvin saw that, which is why he sought to articulate a robust doctrine of the substance of the Son. The problem, though, is that as soon as you start talking about the substance of a person, you tread headlong into tritheism of the sort which Eastern Orthodox Christianity is very guilty. And I think if there is a place to fall that is safe, it is certainly on the side of the West. The especially sort of the Neo-Eastern Orthodox formulations of the Trinity, which insist upon formulating the three in terms of energy and are satisfied with using perichoresis as a strategy of achieving divine unity, that is absurd. That's not even worth dealing with, honestly. It's not. That's a bald contradiction with the Christian tradition even before the split between East and West, and ultimately compromises a doctrine of divine unity sufficiently to say, well, I don't even think it's a credo formulation anymore. Where the West, so the East is clearly explicitly stating a metaphysics of tritheism. The West is I think. The theory is a modalist theory of the Trinity in the West. I think the Augustinian Trinitarianism theoretically is modalism, but I appreciate it because it's always trying to buck against its own tendency towards modalism. And as long as we can keep bucking in that direction, as long as we can keep bucking in the direction of, but we need to substantivize the three somehow, because they are distinct, and to speak of them as only real relative to one another, but not real relative to the essence that they share, it doesn't sufficiently articulate all of the exegetical and theological data which we must use to formulate orthodoxy. We have to do something like what Cornelius Van Til does with his doctrine of the one and the three, where he says we don't prioritize the one or the three. They are equally ultimate. They are simultaneously prioritized. Now, what does that require of us? It requires us to take a Thomistic conception of the one and still yet somehow radically substantivize the three. And I don't know what the solution. This has been my goal in this video, to highlight This is what is mysterious about the Trinity. It is the sliding scale between prioritizing the one, prioritizing the three. I think whatever the answer is has something to do with what Cornelius Van Til has done with what he calls the equal ultimacy of the one and the three. I don't know what the path forward is that. The best thing I've read on this is, of course, Lane Tipton's dissertation on Van Til's doctrine of the Trinity, where he gets it from Hodge and Calvin and a few other sources. But I think the key to that is in what Tipton's dissertation does, drawing on Van Til, and Van Til is, of course, drawing on Calvin's doctrine of the autotheos of the Son, which is a whole mess, which many people think was a terrible, terrible doctrinal heresy that Calvin proposed in his Trinitarian theology, which I think is actually pointed in the right direction, which is to somehow substantivize the subsistences of the Trinity, and people who have adopted unthinkingly or the orthodox language of Thomism to say, well, they're just distinct minor relations, they're subsisting relations, and that's all we really need to say about that. I just don't think those people have really appreciated the mysteriousness of the doctrine, and therefore the apparent contradiction baked into the very formula that we use, even in nuanced academic theological discourse about the Trinity. So to conclude, critics of Christianity often point to the Trinity as an example of the logical incoherence of Christianity. But with all Christian mystery, of course, it's a necessary aspect of theological work. Mystery always is a necessary aspect of theological work. And just as a sailor can't see what's beyond the horizon, a theologian can't conceive theologically too far beyond his historical moment. And this is why the articulation of theological truth has become better every century since the resurrection. And of course, error gets weirder and weirder, right? Even while errors multiply along with the truth, theological mystery will always exist because the science itself deals with an object that is unlike any other scientific object. God exists independently and archetypally, and we know him ectypally, and we must operate with an awareness of that distinction, that everything we do is dealing with an articulation which is a refraction of the actual truth. We are dealing with refractive derivations of the object itself, which is God, which is really the glory or weight or essence or substance of God. And the problem with those who criticize Christianity from the outside is that they are unable to genuinely make a distinction between the creator and creature. So because they are unable to make this distinction, they are unable to accept the very premise of revelation, which frames and founds our distinction between archetypal and ectypal theology. And because unbelieving philosophers of religion or critics of Christianity or whatever it is, because they are unable to accept the premise of revelation, they are unable to conceive of the existence of the only evidence that you or I have for God's triunity, which is not a flower and it's not an egg. It is his speech about himself. And so, when someone critiques Christianity because it is irrational, using the Trinity as an example, your response can be very simple. You can simply say to them, hey, your argument is this. I don't accept the Trinity because I don't accept that the Trinity spoke to you that the Trinity exists. And you can say, yeah, I already know that you believe that. Because any criticism of Christianity ultimately is an analytic criticism which merely communicates that they don't accept Christianity to begin with, which you already know. And so when you deal with Christian mystery, you can say you don't accept the very premises which make possible Christian mystery to begin with, which means the only way you can conceive of mystery from the outside is as a contradiction. So all it tells me is that you articulate Christian mystery as an unbeliever exactly the way Christianity says an unbeliever would articulate Christian mystery. Because you don't have to defend the Trinity to an unbeliever, all because you fundamentally don't have the same theological methodology. They fundamentally reject the very methodological premises which make possible theological mystery. And until you resolve the question of revelation, you shouldn't even be talking about the Trinity. And I'm not saying you shouldn't be talking as in there's an ethical law or something like that says that you can't talk about the Trinity with unbelievers. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that logically, There are prior methodological concerns that come before the Trinity that have more to do with the very nature of divine revelation per se. Once you start talking about revelation, you get off this topic of the Trinity. Then you're able to talk about the very preconditions in which theological mystery can occur, which allows you to actually make the apologetic conversation more about theology itself rather than a philosophical or philosophy of religion approach to the Trinity, which is, of course, always going to conclude that it's absurd. But as Christians, we're dealing with revelation. We're dealing with God's speech. We are taking God at his word with it, which is a methodological precondition in which Christian mystery is made possible. And on that ground, you can move forward with confidence in your attempt to nuance your Trinitarian doctrine with a sensitivity toward rejecting modalism and rejecting tritheism. And as long as you do this, you stand on solid ground, continuing in an articulation of a mysterious reality, a refraction of divine incomprehensibility in the context and in the tradition of Christian orthodoxy, and you ought to do so creatively, joyously, and soundly with zeal.